As America entered the 1900s, the world was changing rapidly. But no one could have predicted just how much happened and how fast. Join us for a look back at incredible moments of the 20th century. At the turn of the century, trolleys were replacing horse-drawn streetcars and travel was exciting, speeding through the country on rails of steel. In the West, cattle ranching was big business, and the legendary Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, and Sitting Bull captivated young and old alike with the greatest show of them all. All this set the stage for the first decade. An era rich with incredible inventions. Thomas Alva Edison lit the way. Electricity and the light bulb turned night into day, and that changed the way we lived and worked. Edison's record player machine made music just by turning the crank. And his first peep show projector, the kinetoscope, brought moving pictures to amusement parks and penny arcades across the land. And the new Brownie Kodak camera, which only cost $1, made picture taking easy as pressing a button. Even better were pictures that moved. By the end of the decade, 100,000 theaters, called Nickelodeons, sprang up all over the country. Man's dream of flight finally came true in December of 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, as Wilbur and Orville Wright, bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, tested their new flying machine. They had built it with bicycle parts, stretched muslin, and a gasoline engine. With Orville at the controls, the flight lasted only 12.5 seconds, but just long enough to make history. By 1909, the U.S. Army had bought its first plane from the Wright brothers. It carried 2 men 125 miles and flew for an hour without refueling. Such inventions were highlighted at the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. The public was dazzled with an innovative and dramatic use of electricity. The City of Lights drew power from a generator located at Niagara Falls. President McKinley welcomed more than 50,000 spectators to the fair as moving picture cameramen recorded the moment for posterity. Yet triumph turned to tragedy only one day later. A large crowd in the Temple of Music watched in horror as the president was shot down by an assassin's single bullet. Within a week, McKinley was dead and the nation mourned. The new president, Theodore Roosevelt, was sworn in immediately and began a term of peace and prosperity. Few presidents were as popular as Roosevelt. Although he disliked the name Teddy, that's what most Americans called him. And for the first time, kids grew up with teddy bears. By 1904, Roosevelt's popularity was so great that he was nominated and re-elected for another term, giving a square deal to all. The incredible engineering feats of the first decade formed a foundation which would change the face of America and the world. In 1900, New Yorkers marveled at the start of construction of 3 huge steel suspension bridges, the Williamsburg, Queensboro, and Manhattan. In 1904, the New York subway opened its first section, taking commuters from 14th Street to 42nd Street in less than 10 minutes. That same year, electric locomotives were tested in Schenectady. And construction began on the Panama Canal, the most ambitious engineering project in history. Progress couldn't stop natural disasters, however. A fire in downtown Baltimore during the winter of 1902 destroyed much of the city's business district. In 1906, San Francisco experienced the worst disaster of the decade. Hundreds were killed in a massive earthquake. Fires raged for days, taking an even greater toll. 6 square miles of city were ruined, and 500,000 were left homeless. As America moved into the teens, social reform came to the forefront. And in 1912, as Woodrow Wilson took office, he called Congress into special session to enact new laws. These laws brought sweeping change. Banking and currency reform, the Federal Trade Commission, the income tax, and even antitrust laws. All were set down to protect the public interest. Although the movement for child labor laws took longer to resolve, by 1916, laws were in place that began to curb industry's abuse of child labor. In 1919, women's suffragists won the right for women to vote equally with men. On the industrial front, incredible breakthroughs in technology were being made. In 1913, New York City saw the opening of two amazing buildings, Grand Central Station and F.W. Woolworth's 58-story Cathedral of Commerce, the tallest office building in the world. And in Detroit, Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line, reducing the time it took to assemble a car from 14 hours to 93 minutes. By 1914, Americans purchased over 500,000 automobiles, most of them Fords. The nation's most popular all-American sport, baseball, drew thousands of fans to a single game. To accommodate the crowds, Fenway Park opened in Boston in 1912, and the next year, Ebbets Field opened in New York. But baseball's popularity was minor when compared to the amazing rise of Hollywood, movie capital of the world. During the teens, movies became our fifth largest industry. California's climate proved ideal for making pictures year-round, especially westerns. Hollywood's first western star was Bronco Billy Anderson. In 1914, an unknown actor made his first appearance as the Little Tramp in a film called The Kid's Auto Race. Within months, Charlie Chaplin was famous around the world. Before the decade ended, he became the king of comedy. While America prospered and grew, major upheaval was taking place in Europe. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated, and within a month, Europe was at war. On May 7, 1919, the passenger ship Lusitania was torpedoed by the Germans off the Irish coast. It went down in 18 minutes. There were only 726 survivors. Nearly 1,200 civilians were lost. Although America tried to remain neutral, by 1917, Germany's unrestrained warfare had pushed us to the breaking point. On April 6th, American troops went to France. Thousands volunteered without realizing how long and bloody the fight would be. When Germany finally surrendered on the 11th day, at the 11th hour, the Allies rejoiced. The war was over, and American soldiers came home to their wives, mothers, and sweethearts. In cities and towns all across the land, thousands, then millions joined in the celebration. We were at peace, and during the next decade, we took steps to stay that way. In the 20s, drinking was made illegal, and throughout the decade, prohibition was the law of the land. 1,500 federal agents tried to enforce the law, but were no match for rum runners and racketeers. Some gangsters like Al Capone seemed almost beyond the law. And so began the foothold of organized crime in America. In time, widespread public outrage would lead to Prohibition's repeal, but not in the 20s. The radio was the biggest entertainment story of the decade. When KDKA Pittsburgh, the first commercial broadcast station, went on the air in 1920, some dismissed it as just a fad. But by 1923, there were more than 500 stations throughout the nation. And by 1929, 1 out of 3 families had a radio. And millions stayed tuned to their radios as the Scopes monkey trial was broadcast live. John Scopes, a Tennessee high school biology teacher, was brought to trial for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. Clarence Darrow defended Scopes, and William Jennings Bryant stood for the prosecution. Although Bryant won the case, his popularity was greatly diminished by what Americans heard live. Bryant's prosecution brought to light the inequity of the Tennessee law, which prohibited teachers from teaching any theory other than divine creation. News, as a visual medium, made a great step forward with the introduction of sound. Movie audiences viewed for the first time what was called the newsreel.
But I am assured that a photo film of this scene is to be produced, combining a record both for the eye and the ear, a record that may be described as a speaking, moving picture.
The 20s were years of enormous change, and without the automobile, the prosperity of this era would have been impossible. Within a generation, 2 out of 3 families owned a car. Detroit became a modern mecca. People came to marvel at the way cars were made at the Ford plant assembly line. Nearly 30 million cars crowded our country's roads by the end of the decade. This was also an era of exploration and adventure. Admiral Richard Byrd received the Congressional Medal of Honor for being the first to reach the North Pole. Shortly afterward, Byrd became the first to reach the South Pole, also by air. But the biggest hero of all was Charles Lindbergh. Just before dawn on May 20th, 1927, Lindbergh took off in the spirit of St. Louis, aiming to complete the first successful transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. By doing so, Lindbergh became an international hero overnight.
For Lindbergh, oh what a flying fool was he. Lindbergh, his name will live in history. Over the ocean he flew all alone, gambling with fate and with dangers unknown. Others may take that trip.
In 1929, people were buying stocks and making fortunes overnight, buying more and more with money they didn't have. But in October, the stock market crashed, and with it went the fortunes of many. In the closing weeks of the decade, few could predict the terrible consequences of the collapse. By 1930, the incredible repercussions of the crash were being felt throughout the country. 4 million Americans were without work. By 1931, unemployment doubled. By 32, 15 million were without jobs and growing desperate. The Depression was everywhere. People took to the streets selling apples, pretzels, even underwear. Shanty towns sprang up around city dumps. Many went hungry. Some starved. Millions roamed the land becoming hobos, begging or stealing to stay alive. Thousands of farmers, unable to pay mortgages, lost their land and took to the road looking for work. To make matters worse, nature stepped in with an incredible show of power. Unbelievable winds turned the plains into a giant dust bowl. Farms were buried or blown away. Topsoil was carried as far east as New York and Connecticut. And so began the Great Migration West. In the 30s, 250,000 farmers made the trek to California. Disaster struck the East in 1936 in the form of devastating floodwaters. Parts of downtown Pittsburgh were under more than 10 feet of water. Johnstown, Pennsylvania was hit the worst just after the Christmas holiday. 900 people were killed and over 500,000 were left homeless. By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in 1932, the nation was in shambles. But he brought with him a New Deal.
And I am certain that on this day, my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This nation is asking for action, and action now.
Roosevelt took action. He immediately introduced emergency banking legislation and declared a bank holiday. When he said, "I think it's time for beer," Congress quickly agreed. And for the first time in more than a decade, people could drink without breaking the law. In 1937, New Deal legislation gave workers the right to organize and strike. John L. Lewis, labor's greatest leader of the decade, first organized the miners. Then he helped auto workers force General Motors to unionize. U.S. Steel followed suit, and by 1938, 8 million Americans were union members. In the sports arena, truly the most incredible moment of the decade was the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Germany. Hitler's plans to position the games as a show of Aryan superiority were broken, as a black American from Cleveland, Jesse Owens, ran to 3 gold medal victories. He earned the title of the fastest man in the world. The victories of the 30s were seldom that sweet. War was in the wind everywhere. In September 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's power was growing fast. By 1933, he was Chancellor of Germany, and stormtroopers were a common sight. In Italy, Mussolini's forces were also marching. By 1935, they had taken Ethiopia, and by the fall of 1937, Japan was bombing China. In March of '38, Hitler's Germany swallowed Austria. By the fall of 1939, war was all around us, as Roosevelt spoke to Americans by radio.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. I have said not once but many times that I have seen war and that I hate war. I say that again and again. I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will.
As we ushered in the 40s, Americans were determined to remain neutral. The Japanese had other ideas. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Immediately thereafter, Germany declared war on the U.S.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
America quickly geared up to fight a major world war on 2 fronts, Europe and the Pacific. Industry quickly shifted into production, building tanks, ships, guns, and planes. Women filled jobs normally taken by men to supplement the workforce. America's overwhelming ability to produce armaments helped to bring down the Axis powers. Thousands of men volunteered, and within weeks, they were ready to be shipped off to war. In the spring of '42, Congress authorized women in the military. Within a year, 100,000 WACs, WAVES, WASPs, and women Marines all went through basic training. The end of the war came in Europe early 1945. Mussolini and his mistress were strung up in a public square. Hitler committed suicide in Berlin, and the Europeans poured into the streets to celebrate peace after 6 long years of war. In the Pacific, the hell continued, and the losses were staggering. Kamikaze pilots became Japan's most lethal weapon, crashing planes onto the flight decks of our carriers. And then, America launched the most deadly weapon of all. New President Truman shared the news with the nation.
Let there be no mistake. we shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the atom bomb in the city of Hiroshima. More than 75,000 were killed instantly. 3 days later, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The war was finally over. On September 2nd, on the battleship Missouri, MacArthur accepted the surrender from Japanese Emperor Hirohito.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
With our troops back home, a new American dream of a wife, kids, and a dog in a vine-covered cottage began to take shape. This was the beginning of the baby boom. In the 40s, over 5 million babies were born. These children became the first generation to grow up in front of the television set. By 1946, over 7,000 homes had TVs, and by 1947, there were more than 1 million viewers. And what were we watching on June 25th, 1950? Incredible as it seems, yet another war. Americans joined the fight in Korea against the communist aggressors. This bloody battle led by General MacArthur lasted 3 long years. Nearly 50,000 Americans and over 3 million Chinese were killed. At home, the Cold War against Russia and the fear of communism was our biggest threat. McCarthy's communist witch hunt in 1950 blacklisted thousands of innocent people. Throughout the decade, the stars were always making news. Frank Sinatra married Ava Gardner. Elizabeth II was crowned Queen of England. Grace Kelly became a princess when she married Rainier of Monaco. Elvis Presley enlisted in the Army. And Bobby Soxer, Farah Diba, made a rags-to-riches fairy tale come true when she wed the Shah of Iran. New technology gave us the first coaxial cable, linking TV coast to coast in '51. 40 million Americans watched President Truman speak at the World Trade Fair in San Francisco. We were mesmerized by TV. Hopalong Cassidy, The Fights, Howdy Doody, Kukla, Fran and Ollie, the Texaco Theater, Arthur Godfrey, The Toast of the Town, and our show of shows with Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca. The most dramatic medical advance of the decade was the Salk vaccine. It immunized people against the dreaded crippler, polio. Within months, all children were vaccinated free of charge, and America's devastating polio epidemic was over for good. Scientific advances also brought us the H-bomb. The world began a new era in fear of nuclear annihilation.
That you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, the world was at the height of the Cold War. Communist guerrillas were in Laos, Cambodia, and Fidel Castro, who had come to power in 1959, gave the go-ahead to put missiles in Cuba. The Bay of Pigs crisis nearly catapulted us back into war, but the Russians backed off and the tension eased. Nuclear weapons had put a new slant on the meaning of war. Tragedy struck suddenly in November 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald. the nation was plunged into shock, but no one could predict that this was just the beginning. In the 60s, the civil rights movement reached a boiling point. Although blacks finally had the right to register to vote, they had not won true equality. Many black Americans joined in nonviolent protests throughout the country, and Martin Luther King emerged as the symbol of the nonviolent civil rights movement.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Within hours, Martin Luther King was assassinated.
In his last sermon, Dr. King referred to himself as a drum major. With his death, the drums are louder still. We do not yet know whether they are a summons to battle or to the meeting of reconciliation and peace. That choice, it seems to me, is largely up to us. This generation did not create most of the conditions and the convictions which have led us to this day, but this generation has a responsibility to resolve them.
Only 3 months later, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy, too, was murdered by an assassin's bullet. The legacy of hope which these three men left us gave many the determination that we would overcome. In the 60s, we lived in front of the TV set, and what we saw in living color was Vietnam, the first living room war. Chet Huntley, David Brinkley, Walter Cronkite, and Howard K. Smith told us over dinner what was happening, complete with commercial breaks. When we got tired of it, we turned it off. But the GIs were not so lucky. Our involvement in Vietnam from the start was controversial on the home front, and the tales of horror we saw broadcast made many cry out in protest. On a lighter note, the most incredible phenomenon of the decade was the Beatles. The four lads from Liverpool set the world of music on its ear and captured the hearts of American teenagers everywhere. In science and technology, we set our sights on the moon. America's space program kicked into high gear during the 60s, and our astronauts amazed the world. John Glenn was the first man to orbit the Earth. Ed White, the first to walk in space. And in July 1969, the crew of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, took one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. We achieved the unbelievable. Man had walked on the moon and returned to tell the story. By 1970, protests over the war in Vietnam and Cambodia reached fever pitch when President Nixon called the National Guard to Kent State University to squelch the demonstrations. The inexperienced Ohio Guard opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. Americans were outraged, and many continued to protest widely until the war ended in 1973. To add fuel to the fire, 5 months before President Nixon won his second term of office, the Watergate scandal shook the Nixon administration apart. 5 burglars and 2 White House aides were charged and convicted of bugging and burglarizing records from the Democratic Party headquarters. Although it could not be proven at the time, the money for this affair was thought to have come from the Presidential Campaign Fund. Then, Nixon stunned the nation by announcing that 4 of his top advisors were leaving because of Watergate. As the Senate probed, they uncovered White House tapes kept by the president. When Nixon was asked to turn them over, he refused. In October 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew, accused of taking bribes while serving as governor of Maryland, resigned. Gerald Ford took his place. Under pressure, the president finally turned over the tapes, but once it was discovered that 2 of the 9 were missing and there was an 18.5-minute gap in another, the public cried out for impeachment. It took a Supreme Court ruling to force Nixon to turn over the remaining tapes, but it was too late. Impeachment proceedings began. On August 8, 1974, a broken Nixon told the public of his resignation.
To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The next day, Gerald Ford was sworn in as president. In 1973, the Arabs began an oil embargo to protest U.S. military aid to Israel, lasting nearly 6 months. It had a terrible effect on the economy. The price of gas doubled. Shortages were everywhere. Rationing began, and the president ordered gas stations closed on Sundays. As a result, we resolved to find gas and other sources of energy on American soil. And in search of other forms of energy, a controversial new industry was born: nuclear power. In 1976, Americans celebrated the bicentennial in grand style across the country. Thousands signed a giant birthday card on the White House lawn, and spectacular fireworks were set off from coast to coast. Revolutionary violence erupted in Iran in 1978. Angered by President Carter's decision to permit the Shah to come to the U.S., followers of the Ayatollah seized the American embassy in Tehran and took 60 American hostages, demanding the return of the Shah in exchange for the prisoners. Militants threatened their captives with death. The agreement, which resulted in freeing the hostages, was Jimmy Carter's crowning achievement. Time had run out for Carter, however, and the hostages were welcomed home by Ronald Reagan as he was being sworn in as the 39th President of the United States. Reagan was voted into office, promising a simpler, more conservative age and leadership that would get the country moving again. That same year, both Reagan and Pope John Paul II were shot by assassins. Thankfully, both recovered. An event which invoked the incredible outpouring of national spirit came in 1980 during the Olympic Games in Lake Placid, New York. An inexperienced and very young American ice hockey team defeated a supposedly superior Soviet team and gave Americans something to cheer about. Incredible natural disasters marked the 80s with startling regularity and unbelievable magnitude. One after another, earthquakes devastated entire cities throughout the world. Mexico and Armenia were 2 of the hardest hit. Periodic shocks throughout the 80s in California reached a climax in San Francisco in 1989, just as the San Francisco Giants and Oakland A's were beginning the World Series. Although the quake was of similar magnitude as the 1906 disaster, structural and architectural advances of recent decades kept most of the city intact. Just a month before, Hurricane Hugo, the decade's fiercest storm, pulverized the eastern seaboard, wiping out entire communities and devastating the Carolina coast. Tragedy struck our space program in 1986. Millions of Americans had tuned in their TVs to see civilian Krista McAuliffe become America's first school teacher to fly into space aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. After watching a picture-perfect liftoff, we stared in disbelief at the explosion before our eyes. In an instant, all lives were lost. Medical technology advanced to new heights with the development of the artificial heart. Although not perfected, this incredible breakthrough allowed us to glimpse what medicine might someday be. Heroism and the volunteer spirit shone brightly in 1987 as the nation watched their TVs with bated breath, while 18-month-old Jessica McClure was rescued after 57 hours in a dry well. In 1985, celebrities rallied the world with a Live Aid concert in major cities throughout the globe, broadcast live via satellite. In 1987, Americans celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty, our symbol of freedom. Progress towards nuclear disarmament quickened significantly under the leadership of Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev. Barriers built over the previous 40 years were beginning to break down.
I offer a toast, a commitment on behalf of the American people of seriousness, goodwill, and hope for the future.
1989 was truly the most incredible year of the decade, if not the century. In May, the youth of China, mostly students, marched for democracy. Peaceful demonstrations in Tiananmen Square turned into a bloody massacre as the world watched in horror. Then, with unbelievable momentum, communism began to fall, first in Poland and Hungary as barbed wire was cut away, then in Czechoslovakia, and finally in Berlin as the wall separating East and West was torn down. It is moments like these, from the history-making to the heartwarming, and from the tragic to the unbelievable, that have made our 20th century so incredible, and in some way, prepare us for the challenges of the future.